Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand today to speak in favour of this MPI put forward by my colleagues. What we saw yesterday in Queensland was a disgrace. An attack on the freedom of press in this country, an attack on the freedom of everyday Australians to have their voices and their concerns heard about what goes on, the decisions that their government makes. Australia is a wonderful democracy. We're a free and open democracy. Transparency should be at the heart of all of this. The idea that protesters are being intimidated from being able to peacefully show their discontent with government decisions or company actions, let alone then the crackdown of the police to journalists who are simply doing their job and reporting on these protests. And what is the government afraid of? What is the government afraid of that they don't want the rest of the country or indeed the world to see? Well, rather than shutting this down, what we've seen is that Australians are very, very wary. The moment a government comes in and tries to silence people, you know something's actually going on. The moment a government comes in and says, well, we're going to send in the police force to shut down the protests and to shut up the journalists, you know there is actually a real problem. And this is in a long line, of course, of erosions of press freedom in this country over the last number of years. Thankfully, just moments ago, here in the Senate, in this place, we've seen this chamber establish an inquiry into press freedom in this country. Thank goodness, because we need to get to the bottom of what's really going on and what laws need to be in place to ensure journalists can do their job without fear or favour. But of course this is much bigger than this, because what we saw yesterday in Queensland is a demonstration of the heavy-handedness of not just this government, but obviously the Queensland government and what is to come. If decent Australians don't stand up and demand their rights to have their voices heard and to be able to protest peacefully. And this is happening at a time when our television at the moment is full of footage of what's going on the streets in Hong Kong, where everyday citizens in Hong Kong are putting their positions on the line, their lives on the line, for democracy. They are fighting for democracy, and they're fighting for the right for a free and open press and the right to be able to dissent peacefully without the fear of retribution. And here in Australia, and I hear my colleague here, Senator Canavan, arguing that there was an election. Well, yes, there was an election, and yet many people, millions of Australians did not vote for the policies of this government. Many Australians are very concerned about the policies of this government, particularly when it comes to the issues of climate change and approving one of the world's largest coal mines, and that is, of course, Adani. But this is what's wrong with this government, because as I stand here defending the rights of everyday Australians, whatever view they hold, to be able to protest without the fear of arrest and intimidation, where I stand here today in support of journalists being able to just do their job, I can hear the screeching from members of the government who think because they won an election, it should be a free-for-all. Because they won an election, they are so arrogant that they think nobody else's view should matter. And that is how these people rule. They are a group of self-entitled grubs, that they think no one else should be able to have their opinion or even protest peacefully or report on these protests because they hold the keys to the lodge. And that is the arrogance of this government, the hubris of this government. And we can see it all over the place. Even just today, even the Prime Minister has had to tell his own colleagues in the party room today to pull their heads in because the arrogance is getting out of hand. You've got now members of the government arguing that we should have nuclear power in Australia, we should change the government's policies on super, that we shouldn't have members like Senator Dean Smith, who stood up yesterday in this place with his own voice and his own conscience and stood up and argued that New Start should be lifted. But what's happened? No, the Prime Minister wants to rule with an iron fist. The Prime Minister wants to rule with an iron fist, and the result of that is that it trickles down to the individuals right around this country, everyday citizens and Australians who should have the right to stand up for what they believe in, to stop the dangerous projects that they see is going to impact on the future of their kids. The Adani coal mine is an issue that affects every Australian. It's not just for people like Senator Canavan over here to say because he's now on the front bench it should be his way or the highway. It shouldn't just be that this government can intimidate individual citizens from voicing their opinions and to send chills through the media agencies across this country and indeed now overseas, because they shouldn't report on protests, they shouldn't report the facts of what's going on, they shouldn't ask questions of the government without fear of being charged, locked up and arrested. And we don't live in a police state. I know Senator Canavan might want us to, but we don't. We don't live in a police state. We live in a free and open democracy, and our citizens have the right to stand up, to have their voices heard, to protest peacefully, and I call on them to continue to do that, because at a time when we are facing such a crisis when it comes to our climate, when it comes to our environment, when it comes to now, as we're seeing, the erosion of freedom of the press, freedom of everyday Australians to just have their own opinions and their voices heard, this is a moment to stand up and stare down the government who thinks it should be their way or the highway. Well, no, we're not going to stand here and let the government run roughshod over everything. We're not going to stand here and allow the government to intimidate everyday people from having their own opinions and standing up for their own land. Well, of course, this government doesn't even think that farmers should have the right to say that they don't want mining operations in their own backyard. This government doesn't believe that everyday Australians should be able to stand up and protest against spending billions of dollars propping up the coal industry. This government doesn't think that journalists should be able to report the facts without fear or favour. And that is what is going on here today. And you can hear the hubris from the other side. Senator Canavan, he thinks it should be his way or the highway. That is the arrogance of this government. That is the arrogance. That is the arrogance of the Morrison government. It's the arrogance of the Morrison government, that they think it should be their way and nobody else's. And what they're doing is putting at risk not just our environment, not just our climate, but they're putting at risk our democracy. I asked in the chamber earlier today, during question time, of our Foreign Affairs Minister, Senator Payne. I asked her what she is going to do to help relieve the anxiety that there is of the erosion of press freedom in this country. We've had 4 French journalists arrested, held for several hours, arrested, charged, all because they were simply reporting on a peaceful protest. A peaceful protest that happened to be against a project that this government is in love with. A project that this government, members of in this place, have taken donations from the company who wants to set this project up. No wonder they don't want anyone, either in Australia or now overseas, knowing about what's going on. And this is a danger not just to our environment, this is a danger to our democracy. And unless we protect the rights of people to protest, to dissent, to ask questions, to report the facts, whether or not the government likes them or not, then we are on a slippery slope towards the type of arrogance and rule with an iron fist that this government thinks they already have the capacity to do. Well, you don't. We're all watching and we're going to call it out.
Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Deputy President.